was giving myself grace for whatever I needed to feel, right? And not piling on this like, oh, well, I should be feeling this way, or I should be bonding in this way, or I should. It's like, no, no, no. Just give myself the grace to just be where I'm at today and get through today, right? Whatever that looks like.
Welcome back to the You Need a Counselor podcast. This is a show presented by Heart and Solutions Counseling Agency. We release new episodes every Sunday at 5 p.m. Central and encourage you to batch up that laundry, put away the dishes, plan for the week ahead, or do any other task that might seem daunting while you give our show a listen. You might just be encouraged to call your therapist, connect with this week's guest, or seek out those services you've been considering for a while but haven't made the commitment to yet. If you are in the state of Iowa and are in need of mental or behavioral health counseling, give us a call at 1-800-531-4236. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome back to the You Need a Counselor podcast. My name is Dr. Julie Johnson. I'm the president and founder here at Heart and Solutions Mental Health and Behavioral Health Counseling in Iowa.
And I'm Chrissa Hunt. I am our Vice President in charge of the Behavioral Health Department. And this is our podcast, You Need a Counselor. So we are designed for people curious about counseling, but have barriers keeping them from experiencing the benefits of counseling. Our mission is to share stories about counseling, good, bad, and indifferent, and spread the message that everyone can benefit from mental health and behavioral health counseling services.
So our guest today is a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado. She is an author and a public speaker who is passionate about helping people overcome trauma with their mental health concerns. She works with people on different concerns related with faith, with grief, with all of the difficult transitions that we make in our lives, including motherhood, including parenthood, and all other different kinds of transitions that can just be very, very challenging and can involve a lot of grief that we might not even recognize as grief when it shows up in our lives. So we've got Lauren Pryor here joining us from Colorado. Welcome, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, good to be here.
Thank you. So now you are a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado. So can you tell us about what that means and what it is that you do out there?
Yeah, so I own my own private practice, which means I just have a little office and kind of have my own little business, just myself. And I see clients, every week. See a good bit, probably about 20 or so a week, and work with people. I do a lot of trauma work, do a lot of train in EMDR, do a lot of that, but just work with anybody and everybody. And like you said, with grief and transitions and anxiety and all of the above. And I've been doing it for about 13 years now. So yeah, quite a bit of experience, been doing this a long time. So, and still love it. So.
Awesome. I would love to hear your story, kind of what got you into counseling and then kind of led you to work on mostly like that grief and trauma as well that you work with.
Yeah, so okay, that's a two-part story for sure. So I'll answer the first part, kind of what led me to counseling and to begin with. This is sort of a fun story. So I actually was into theater in high school. I was loved acting, and I thought I wanted to be a movie star or something. I don't know. And then at some point I thought, well, maybe I really want to be a theater teacher. I thought my theater teacher was really impactful and influential in my life, and I thought, yeah, that would be really cool. And then as I got into college and I started really evaluating what I really wanted to do, I kept coming back to all these like psychology classes I was taking and how much I really enjoyed them. Um, and, at some point, I don't know if it was in college or if it was later, I ended up sort of making the connection, which I thought was interesting. So when I was doing acting, one of the things that I loved about acting, I used to love, I remember reading books about method acting, if you've ever heard of that term, where you really kind of get into the mind of that character and you're trying to portray who they are. And I thought that was so interesting. And, if I wasn't going to be an actress, that's what I would try to do, is to be a method actress. Um, and then I realized, like, wait a minute. now what I do every day is to try to really get into the mind and heart of other people and understand how they're seeing life and how to try to help them navigate the mess that they're in. And so it's like realizing that what I loved about acting actually absolutely translated into the counseling world. Um, so that was kind of it. I got my undergrad in kind of psychology and human learning, and then went on to get my master's in professional counseling, and haven't looked back. I really enjoy it. So 5 years or so into it, when my first husband, actually tragically passed away, and in a car accident, and then 3 days later I gave birth to our son. And so I got to experience death and life and the craziness of that, and very much experienced my own grief and my own trauma. And I'd been doing some grief and trauma work. The irony is that I got trained in EMDR the year before he died. And so I'd been doing some of that already. And then all of a sudden I was right there in it and was like, wow, okay. So definitely my own experience, and then my own experience in counseling, with that, has definitely made me a better counselor for sure.
Absolutely. What were some of the skills that you had learned as you were getting trained in EMDR that maybe were useful to you or helpful to you when your first husband passed?
Yeah. One of the things that, people, I mean, I remember people maybe commenting, oh, it's a good thing that you were a counselor, right? It's a good thing that you're a therapist. Like you've got this, grief thing, like you're fine. And I'm like, well, like, I know, I mean, it is to my benefit in the fact that I definitely have a lot of knowledge, but the walking it out is still just as hard. It still is just as difficult to walk out that journey of grief. And and so, I think probably the biggest thing that whether it was through EMDR training or just through my training as a counselor, that I really kind of had to lean into and remind myself of quite often, was the fact that, like, I had to lean in to what I was feeling. And so instead of trying to find just any escape, or get out of it in any way, I had to find time to really say, okay, to give myself those moments where I could just grieve and where I could lean into those things that I was feeling and process them and not avoid them. And I think that was the biggest thing, is just knowing that there is no shortcut. You know, Avoiding it only means that I'm prolonging it. And so it was like, okay, if I'm going to get through this, if I'm going to do this journey of grief and of, working through this trauma, then I have to just lean in, and really, let myself feel the things that I need to feel.
Do you think it was easier to seek out counseling when those traumatic experiences happened to you because you're a counselor, or do you think that made it a little more difficult to seek help?
I would say both, actually. There's, obviously, I'm huge proponent. I'm a cheerleader. Yes, everyone needs to go to counseling. Everyone needs a counselor. And so it's like, I don't have any stigma necessarily, but finding a counselor who is experienced enough and who kind of, in my mind knows more than me, or, or like has, can really have something to offer me. And that doesn't, I'm not saying that to sound prideful, but just making sure that I find someone good, is still feels daunting, right? Finding someone who I can really trust and feel like is qualified, and all of that search, still feels overwhelming. And I know it feels overwhelming for everyone going into counseling. I think it's a huge barrier, but um and so that was still hard. It was just really, okay, like asking around, like, and I asked other therapists or other people, like, okay, who do you know? Who have you seen, right? That you love. And so I found someone really amazing who walked through that grief with me, and, did a lot of work with her. And then actually 2 years into my grief, about a year, well, yeah, almost 2 years into my grief, experienced some other just interesting life things, and found myself sort of maybe ready to start dating again. And I was exploring that, and I thought, I need to go back to counseling again. And so, it wasn't just about grief that time. It was also about just processing things in my marriage, okay, if I got this chance to do it differently, how do I want to do it differently? And that was really, really valuable for me to go back into counseling, even when I was doing okay, right? So
Absolutely. I think sometimes that's the best time to go into
yeah.
counseling or go back into counseling is when we're like, no, it's not a crisis. It's okay. I'm doing my daily and it's all right. Right. And that's when we have the bandwidth and the space in our lives to be able to do that proactive work so that when there is a crisis, we've got that relationship established. We've got that routine established. We know that, well, I'm going to see my counselor on Thursday versus the feeling of I have to find a counselor. I have to learn how to get into counseling. I have to trust this person somehow, right before I can start processing this crisis situation that I'm in. So I think that's such a great example. And I was thinking about you when you talk, you can tell that you have some background in theater because when you talk you bring these images into my head, so as you're talking
Thank you.
having these images and the connection between theater and counseling is so strong. Now I wouldn't have thought of it, I mean it really they seem so different,
Right.
but at the heart of it is really that experiencing life through somebody else's eyes and experiencing life through somebody else's perspective. It reminds me of that movie, a couple of movies, John Malkovich, being John Malkovich.
Uh-huh.
Have you guys
Yeah.
seen that? Where,
Yeah.
yeah, he's walking around, he can see what he sees, he can feel what he feels. And also the Disney movie Soul. Have you
Uh,
guys seen that?
mhm.
Right? And where he's goes into the cat's body at one point, right? And he's experiencing life as a cat. And uh, that connection there between the two, I just think is so interesting because method acting isn't even about entertainment.
Mm-mm.
Which, so much of acting we think about, okay, well, I'm going to go see this comedy movie or something, right? To be entertained. And method acting is so much deeper than that. It's no, I want to go see this person experience what the situation is in the movie because that allows me to experience
Yeah,
what
exactly.
the situation is in the movie without having to live it in my
Right.
life, right?
Yep.
So I just love that connection that you highlighted. And I think it's so helpful for somebody who's thinking about counseling or is on the fence about counseling to understand that therapists do have that perspective where, like, no, I want to know what it's like to live your life as you with all of your thoughts and all of your feelings, because it can really take away that layer of shame that can sometimes permeate a session, right? From as a client perspective to come in and go, you don't want to hear about all of this, right? Like you don't want to hear about how the grocery store gave me smushed bread. You know what I mean? Like you don't want to hear about that, but we do want to hear about it
Right.
because the fact that it's still in your mind means that it has some significance that's not squished bread. And if I understand where you're coming from on that, I understand how important it is
Right.
that somebody take care of the bread that they're putting into your cart. And so I think I just love that example
Yeah.
that you gave and your history there. I also love the imagery you gave uh, of walking through
Mhm.
grief versus having the head knowledge of how to process trauma because it in my mind it put us in a forest where you've got a map and knowing EMDR skills and techniques is like having a map of a forest.
Right.
But having a counselor do that with you is like having a guide that knows that forest. And you might be a guide of a different forest. You might take people through
Mm.
that forest all the time and know
Right.
it like the back of your hand. But when you're going through a new forest, you've got to have a guide. Even if you have a map, you know your way through the map, but it's totally different looking at it as on a map than walking it through the forest and having that guide, that therapist there that knows that forest and can walk you through it is absolutely valuable. So I love that perspective that you're bringing to it as well. So you talked about dating after grief, and this is a topic that we haven't had on the
Mm.
show before. Very, very interesting. So how did you know that you said that things were okay in your life. So what were some of those signs that you saw that you went, okay, I want to process this through a little more?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm like, how do I con make this concise, right? The really kind of what happened is that, about a year after my husband passed, someone kind of from my past, right? A friend sort of came back into my life, and it was like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I could be open to romance again. And then that crashed and burned really quickly. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, hold on. Um, and I had to then really step back and say, okay, like, there's a fog that comes with grief, and it's something that people talk about a lot. And there was certainly a fog that came with that. And even it was like, oh, I think at first it just felt so good to feel good. And so it was easy to dismiss maybe some of the red flags. And not that this person is a terrible person or anything like that. It just wasn't a good fit. And and had I, many years out or many even years before, I think I probably would have seen that. But then in the midst of that grief, I didn't, or I chose to ignore it. And so then it was like, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, hold on. And then when that crashed and burned and we kind of, broke up, it was like my grief came back in a very real way, because it was immediately like, gosh, I wouldn't be experiencing this grief if you hadn't have died. And and why did you leave me? And I just need you to come back, okay? Like, and so it was this grief came back, and also just this like, okay, all right, if I'm gonna date again, I really want to process through even just some things in my marriage. I mean, we loved each other, and there was a lot of good things, but there was a lot of hard things too. And there was a lot of hard things that we went through together as a couple, and a lot of hard things that we experienced in our marriage that were difficult. And so it was like, I need to unpack all that and really feel like I can then walk into the dating world and approach a new relationship being the healthiest version of myself, and knowing that, like, and it's always one of those questions. And I remember, when I first kind of started dating and I was doing the whole online dating thing, and people would, men would ask the question, oh, well, are you over it? Right. And I'm like, well, newsflash, like, I'll never really be over it. It's not a thing. Right. I love that man. We were married for a long time. I'm never going to be over it. Um, am I healthy? Have I moved on? Have I processed through all of this? Absolutely. But if there are there going to be aspects of my grief that will come back, the memory of him that is there. And then, we have a son together, and like, I want to honor that, and the fact that he has a dad, that he deserves to know about and to talk about. And so it's like, you as this potential, you know, future husband need to know that that's a part of me. You're getting a package deal here. And so, and that weeded out some people, which is probably good. But but one of the things, so I am remarried now. I have a wonderful husband and a blended family. And actually one of the big things that attracted me to my husband initially is, I think we were on our second date, and he kind of told me his story, and he had been through a really hard divorce. And one of the things he said is, he was like, yeah, he's like, I'm still in counseling, and I've been in counseling for the last year and a half. And I'm like, ding, 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 right? Yes, good. Green flag. That you have worked through what has happened, and not just tried to push it down or deny it, or, you are working through it and still working through it, right? And still actively, choosing to work on yourself through this hardship. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you mentioned too, like your son was born 3 days, was it son? Sorry. Yeah, 3 days after your husband passed away. And I know you mentioned as well that you work with clients on that journey of motherhood. I'm sure your journey itself was completely different than some, but can you kind of go over like what are some things that you talk about with that, like not only that you experienced, but also that you work with clients on in that journey of motherhood?
Yeah, goodness. I mean, becoming a new mom is a hard thing for anyone. I mean, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, but it's hard. it's a huge transition, I think, in any woman's life. And it was something that I longed for and wanted for deeply and was so excited for. And then to all of a sudden be thrown into this thing alone was like, whoa, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I bargained for. This wasn't what I was expecting at all. And here I was like, 3 days later having to in labor and without my husband. And so it was just, my birth story, my labor story was wild, as you probably can well imagine. I joke that I got to experience all different types of labor in one. It was kind of a wild journey. And I remember one of my dear, dear friends is a midwife. She's a nurse practitioner and a midwife. And she was there with me, through that, which is beautiful. I'm so grateful. Like I said, she's a good friend of mine. And many months later, we're reflecting back on just all the trauma that I went through, even just with my birth. And she was like, well, Lauren, I really think that in the end, you hit a wall and you needed him. And she's like, you needed your person, and he wasn't there. And so like because anyway, my labor ended up into an emergency C-section because I hit a wall and I needed him. And it was rough. So, but I remember them giving me these like, uh, postpartum depression screeners, and me just looking at them and being like, my husband just died, right? Like, I don't know how to answer this. Like, and because it's like the question's like, have you cried a lot in the last 3 days? Well, yeah, I haven't stopped crying. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you know, um, and so, just having to walk through that. But I think, going back to something I said earlier, it was just the like embracing whatever I needed to feel, right? Just embracing, and when I say embracing, it was giving myself grace for whatever I needed to feel, right? And not piling on this like, oh, well, I should be feeling this way, or I should be bonding in this way, or I should, it's like, no, no, no. Just give myself the grace to just be where I'm at today and get through today, right? Whatever that looks like. Um, and that it is okay to cry with this little baby who is also crying, and it is okay to just be and let myself experience whatever it is that is coming up for me today, and to just give myself lots and lots of grace for this journey that I'm on. And I think that is true for any mother, right? We often try to pile on the shame, or we pile on this like should, or these expectations, and it's like, where is that really coming from? And it doesn't help. It's not helpful for anyone. It's like we have to just back up and say, okay, just let myself be where I'm at today. And one day at a time, 1 hour at a time sometimes, and that's okay. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the the idea of let the day come, let the feelings come, let the experiences come, let all of those things come, because, when we think about like a message in a bottle, right? Like a glass bottle is so delicate, yet they can ride the waves of the ocean. They can survive huge storms, and travel these distances because they have that flexibility they're light enough to just go where the waves and where the wind takes them. And when we struggle against the tides of life and the changes of life and the wind and the currents of life, then that's where items that are in the water get broken, right? That's where they get, because they can't ride with the storm. And so it's hard to do. We feel like we need to tense up. We need to take control of our lives. We need to make things the way that they're supposed to be. We need to make ourselves the way that we think we're supposed to be and show up for other people. And what it does is it weighs us down like an item, like an object that is not flexible and not light enough to float along on the water. And so I had that because I noticed that you said that about, no, let myself feel the feeling that I'm having, because avoiding it prolongs the feeling. And a year from now, I don't want to be feeling this same feeling every time I let my guard down, feeling like that feeling is going to come into my body. Instead, just letting that feeling come into my body and tell my brain and tell my body what it's trying to tell me, so that I can then go, okay, message received. And now there's a new feeling that's going to come, right? And that feeling might be, it may be that first feeling that I'm avoiding with distraction in life and busyness and things like that, right? Maybe that first feeling is sadness, but then maybe that next feeling is anger, and anger at my partner, right? For leaving me, anger with the person that has passed away, because they weren't supposed to. They weren't supposed to pass away at that age. And so that feeling of, well, yeah, if my partner left me to raise my child alone, I'd have a lot of anger with that, no matter what the situation is, right? And the idea that society or other people in our support system might have that, well, you can't be angry with somebody who's passed. That's not true at all. You know, you can be angry at that person, and it is healthy, but sometimes the feeling of, well, I can't be angry at that person. So when that feeling of anger comes, or when I know that there's anger behind that sadness, I'm not even going to feel that sadness, because that means that I'm going to have to feel that anger, and I'm not supposed to, and that's wrong, right? So I love that you're setting that example of, no, feel those feelings. And when you talk about anger with your late husband, yeah, that is legitimate anger. It doesn't take away from how much you that person, and it doesn't take away from that person's memory having those feelings with them. It actually continues that connection that you have with them, right?
Sure.
So I just love all of that. I also, when you talked about being on dating apps and men asking you, "Oh, are you over it?" And when you said, "No, I'm never going to be over it," that's not a thing. I love that. And I think that that needs to be normalized so much more. And the idea that, did you guys ever see the commercial where it's an older man, and he has a picture of his granddaughter, and you see him like lifting a kettlebell, or you see him lifting like one little weight or a rock or a can of soup, stuff like that. And he's got this picture of his granddaughter on his table. And then at the end of the commercial, you see like he's lifting larger and larger things. And at the end of the commercial, his granddaughter runs up to him and he picks her up.
Oh,
And that, to me, I mean, that commercial always makes me cry, but that commercial really, for me, helps me to kind of visualize what you're talking about. Like, no, we don't get over it, and we're not going to counseling to get over it. The fact is that his granddaughter probably weighed 50 pounds. Like, that's what it is. That's not going to change. He's not going, well, let me change her so that she weighs less so that I can pick her up. He's going, no, I'm going to change me. I'm going to change my muscular structure and my arms so that I can pick her up. And that's how it is with grief. Like that, the weight of that doesn't change. We get more in tune with ourselves. We get stronger in our muscles and our ability to cope and process those feelings, and create new situations in our life where we can still have that memory, and we can still have that connection with the person that we've lost. So we get stronger. So I just love that. I think that the messages that you're sharing when you're speaking and when you're writing about this are so important and are so necessary. Um, so you talked about counseling as a green flag. I think that is awesome. Um, so what are some of the challenges that you see for people who have experienced a loss of any kind and want to go into counseling? What are some of those challenges that people have?
a challenge for them trying to get into counseling? Was that yeah. Well, I think obviously, I mean, a huge challenge, which you guys are actively trying to fight against, is that stigma, right? This like idea that somehow means that you're weak. Um, or that you can't handle things on your own, right? That like you should be able to just handle all of that on your own. And I do think that that is changing. I really do see some shift in that direction, which is beautiful, away from that to say that like, no, it's okay. Like we, we can normalize the fact that we go to the dentist and we go to the doctor to have checkups. Like we can go to a counselor too. Like it is okay. But there is that idea that like I should just be able to handle this on my own. And I think the other big barrier sometimes for people too is just, counseling and working through all that stuff is, it's good, it's healthy, it can be really powerful, but it requires vulnerability. It requires them to really face the stuff. It requires them to really be open and honest with someone else, and which means they're also having to be open and honest with themselves. And that's hard. It is, there's nothing about that that's hard. And that's why I always say like the name of my private practice is Walking Brave Counseling. And I always just tell people there's nothing weak about saying I'm facing the issues in my life and I'm breaking patterns in my family history. And I was like, there's nothing weak about that. That requires an incredible amount of bravery and courage to face the hard things in our life, right? It is much weaker to avoid, right? And that is the default, is much weaker to just try to ignore. But it actually is incredibly brave to say, no, I'm doing this. I'm going to face this. I'm going to talk through these things, and I'm going to continue to stay open to the process, right? It's like some people, okay, I'll try it, and they'll try it for a session or two, and then they're like, that's hard. That's uncomfortable. That's weird. That's awkward. I don't want to do that, and it's like, stick with it. You got to get past that awkward stage, and really get into the work. So.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned you are writing a book too. So I'm curious what that is about and what can people expect from the book?
Yeah, so my book is basically a memoir, right? It's basically kind of my story and what it was like to just walk through grief and be a new mom, and just the story of me and my late husband and kind of what we walked through as a couple and how we met and all those things. But obviously, like, I'm a therapist, I'm a counselor, and so those elements of my own journey as well as just, my perspective professionally are definitely integrated into my story, to try to inspire and encourage and help other people too. So.
Yeah, I always love that example of, yeah, counseling. We go to the dentist, and man, how vulnerable are we at the dentist? Like, how ick is it to go to a dentist? And like, I remember, because I mean, we've normalized it as a society so much that it's like, yeah, I have a dentist appointment this afternoon. Like, nobody questions that. But like, when you explain that to your child and you're like, okay, they're going to stick their hand in your mouth and then they're gonna like put this gross stuff on your teeth and then you have to suck on a straw to wash it away. Like, that's gross. Like, how vulnerable do you have to be to lay there with your mouth open like that, right? And let people in your mouth. And so I love that your suggestion for people of like stick with it, because it is ick. And going to a dentist is very ick, right? You have to be very vulnerable for that. And you have to be very vulnerable for counseling as well. And so, but we still go to the dentist because it's important for our health. We still go to a counselor because it's important for our health. So I love that example. Um, and then so your private practice is Walking Brave, and it's in Colorado. And do you do all in-person sessions, or do you do telehealth sessions as well?
Yeah, I do a mix of telehealth and in person. Yeah, I think everyone does these days, right after COVID. But it's great. I think it's opened the world. There's a lot more access, I think, to counseling than there ever has been before, which is a beautiful thing.
Definitely. And then have you always been in private practice, or did you start in a group practice and kind of branch out? And how did that go if you did?
Yeah, no, I definitely have worked in quite a few different agencies and in various places. I think my first couple jobs were definitely in kind of a community mental health agency. I think all counselors kind of have to do their time, right? You have to get in your hours before you get licensed. And but the beauty of that is, even though it's really hard work, usually seeing a ton of people, it's you get thrown into the wolves, it feels like. But you get a lot of experience, with everything under the sun, and that's a great thing. And so yeah, I've definitely worked community mental health, then worked for a few other group practices, and then started working for myself. Actually, started working for myself finally. I'd always been a little bit timid about doing it, and then when my husband died, and here I had this baby, I thought, I was able to take quite a bit of time off, thankfully, and when he was young. But then when it kind of came time for me to go back to work, I thought, okay, now's the time to do it. Like, if I want to have autonomy over my schedule, as a mom, now's the time to start a private practice. So I took the leap, and I'm glad I did. So yeah.
So going back to what you shared about your story too, I'm very interested in the idea of you kind of did couples counseling after your husband had passed. You kind of you yourself kind of did couples counseling for your marriage to your late husband. And I think that is so interesting. And it's something that I think not many people would think about as as a need to go to counseling for, because your husband had passed away. Um, but can you just
Yeah.
tell us more about that? Because from my mind, it helps me to also think about couples counseling in such a different way, because a lot of times we think about couples counseling, well, both partners are doing it, but really when I go to couples counseling with my husband, I'm there to work on me and how I show up in the relationship and in our lives. And so yeah, could you just tell us more about that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, because you know, it's easy sometimes when someone dies, right, to then all of a sudden kind of view everything in lieu of their death, or in light of their death, right? And so it's kind of like, I think initially, it was just like when I was in counseling right after he died, it was really just all about grief, and it was all about just the heartache and what I was walking through. But then, in that grief, it's easy to just like I said, there was a lot of really hard things that we walked through in our marriage. And we had done a little bit of couples counseling, but not enough. And there was just some really hard things that we walked through. He had some medical issues that he went through. And I mean, there was just some difficult paths that we walked in. And I get into more of that in my book, in my memoir, just some of those struggles. Um, but it was easy sometimes in light of the grief to just be like, well, okay, that's over now, right? Like, just move on, and only we'll just remember the good part, right? We'll just remember all the wonderful, beautiful things about him and preserve his memory, right? Which is not bad. Like, that's a good thing. That's an honorable desire. But I think as I got some space, and then, like I said, as I was sort of, okay, dabbling in the dating world, like trying to, navigate what it looked like to be in another relationship or potentially get married again, it was like, okay, wait a minute. There was some really hard things that we went through in our marriage that I just kind of brushed off, right? It's like, oh, well, he died. I guess that's over. And it's like, I need to unpack those things, right? Like, those were tough. Those were hard. And I really need to talk about, and obviously he's not here. We can't talk about how to resolve them, as a couple. But I really needed to process, like, what do I need to learn from my part in that? And what do I need to kind of forgive him for, right? Even after his death. Um, and to really approach the whole situation, just with grace for myself, with grace for him, but knowing that, like, okay, if I'm going to walk into another relationship, I want it to be good. I want it to be healthy. I want it to be right. And so, like, how do I make sure that it's good, and how do I show up as the best version of myself, and to know what I want and know what I don't want, in a partner. And so, yeah, it was a really good experience for me, for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, when we don't address the things in our previous relationships, then and we don't look at not our part in terms of like anything's our fault, but our part in terms of like, hey, when this happened to me that I did not like in the relationship, this is how I felt, this is how I thought about it, this is how I responded to it. And maybe I want to explore other ways that I can do that. And so I think that that's so important when we're moving into that next relationship to do that processing work before. And I think it's the case with divorce situations as well, when there's infidelity situations in a marriage where it can feel like, well, that person was just a jerk then, right? Like well, the marriage is over because of the infidelity. Well, that person was just an unfaithful husband, right? And it's so easy, like you said, to just say, okay, well, that's a them problem, as opposed to then going in. So the idea of even going to couples counseling or to counseling in that couples kind of context, even about an ex-husband or an ex-partner,
Yep.
is so interesting because it's not about them at all, right? I'm not going into counseling to be like, my ex-husband's a jerk. I mean, I probably would say that, right, quite a bit, but I would want to also say, okay, like when that happens, am I going to tolerate that behavior, right? What does it look like to have a boundary where I don't
Yeah.
accept that kind of behavior, right? So I just love that. And I think that when you talked about forgiveness of a person who has passed, it's so I think also easy to think of forgiveness as like it's for the other person, you know? So if I have a person who's hurt me in my life and I feel like, oh, the idea of forgiving them so that I have more peace sounds
Mhm.
terrible because it feels like I'm doing something for them that they don't deserve. And so, but when we talk about forgiving a person who has passed, then it really does highlight how
Yeah.
no, it's not for them, it's for me when I do active and intentional forgiveness. I'm doing it for my own peace, not for theirs. So I think that that is just so beautiful. And I had a client one time who's was having some very difficult challenges with their father, and then their father passed away suddenly. And it is
Yeah.
that kind of, I think, natural feeling of, well, I should just no, everything was great, right? I'm remembering all these great memories and all of that. And so it takes a while to go through that phase of it. And then also sometimes just circle back and be like, look, these are the things we were talking about before they passed. And let's still process those because they still were impactful to you and how you are going to show up in the world. So I just think it's such a beautiful perspective that you have that you're bringing to other people. So I'm very much looking forward to when your book comes out. And I think it would be wonderful to have you back when your book comes out so that we can really get into details of your book as well. But you do public speaking, and so how can people reach out to you if they're interested in public speaking and having you share their story to their group?
Yeah, so my if you go to my website, walkingbravecounseling.org or also walkingbravebook.com, it'll lead you to the same page, and either one you go to, you'll find a contact form where you can reach out and contact me. So
Awesome. Is your speaking usually like your own personal story, or do you do it on like other counseling topics as well?
it can be both. Sometimes it's like I'm a counselor and I've been doing this a long time and have a lot of expertise to offer there. But obviously, I also have a pretty interesting personal story, and so I think sometimes it's can be cool to integrate both of those.
I think that people listening might be curious. I'm curious as well. How your husband's passing 3 days before your son was born, and you spoke a bit about how that impacted you as a new mom. How would you say that that has impacted your son, and what are some of those things that you and your partner now have kind of done to help your son with that?
Yeah, that's yeah, and I remember, he he was a bit colicky as an infant and, was crying and, fussy. And I remember thinking, gosh, like I couldn't have an easy baby, like with everything that I've been through. Um, but I remember really thinking, and obviously in my work in counseling and my work with trauma, like I believe this to be true, but just the fact that like this infant is grieving too. And like he doesn't have words for it. He doesn't have the cognitive like thoughts or words to express or even understand that, but he is. Like there is a loss, and it's not just mine. It's not just that he's feeling my grief, which I'm sure he was, but it's also his own. Like that was his dad. And the fact that his dad was there through the whole pregnancy. He heard him. He was there, I mean, he could hear him through my belly and all of that. And then he's not there anymore, and that he has his own grief. But then realizing that his grief will likely come in layers over time, right? As he gets older, as he starts to understand more. And we talk very openly about his daddy Josh, and that's what we say, is, we kind of as a family say, your daddy Josh is up in heaven, and we'll share memories or stories or talk about him. And every year, kind of on the anniversary of his death, which is also 3 days before his birthday, right, we will I bring out, I call it the Daddy Josh box, and it's the items that I've saved, and I've been very intentional about trying to slowly over time kind of get rid of a lot of things, but there are certain things that I have saved that are very special and very valuable to me and hopefully to him someday. And so we get out the Daddy Josh box and we go through it all and we look at it and we talk about it. Um, and but it will come in layers. There are some things that have happened. We experienced something a couple years ago where, kind of some grief as a family that we walked through. And it was interesting because then it brought up, he started talking about his daddy Josh a lot more. Um, and some of the comments that he even said were just like, whoa, yeah, yeah. Like he made a comment one day because I was talking to someone else. I was talking to my now mother-in-law, and I kind of made a random comment about, oh yeah, Josh used to do that, or, something like that. It wasn't anything significant, anything like that. And about 5 minutes later, he was in the room, just heard me say that. And about 5 minutes later, he crawled into my lap and he curled up and he said, Mommy, I miss Daddy Josh. And I thought, wow, yeah, you do. You never met him, but you do miss him, right? That is still very real, because he was still a part of you. And so my now husband has actually adopted him, which is a beautiful thing too. And I still feel like that we will continue to honor his dad and all of that, but that, while he's here on earth, that he can really feel like he has a dad, and that that's official, and that he's, that we all share the same last name and all of that. And so, but yeah.
Yeah, that's such a cool perspective too. Like, I mean, obviously, as you're going through it when you have a colicky baby, like probably very stressful, but yeah, that he's grieving too. Even, yeah, because being able to hear his dad through that whole pregnancy as well. That's so interesting. But okay, well, thank you so much for being here. We would love to know if you could give a suggestion to somebody on the fence about starting grief counseling or even just counseling in general. What suggestion might you give them?
Just do it, right? Just dive in, rip the Band-Aid, just take that brave first step. That's always the hardest one, is just that first step of reaching out to someone, sending an email, right? Whatever, and just saying, okay, it's time. I'm ready. Um, take that step, give it a try, and see what happens.
Absolutely. I think that's your next book, honestly, the Daddy Josh box. I think that's got to be like your second book. That is absolutely fascinating perspective, and I think something that a lot of parents who have children who are experiencing grief even before they're born really could relate to and really could help them understand their children more. You look at twins who have shared an embryonic sac for 9 months, and then one of them passes, right? There's still grief there. The baby is not going to say, I miss my twin, right? When they're a baby, but they do. And
I have
so,
I have a
yeah.
couple good friends who have children that are adopted, and like we're adopted as infants, and yet we've talked a lot about this grief that that there's some similarities to like their story, and even for my son, and that we've talked a lot about together. It's interesting. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, if you are in Colorado, you can look at www.walkingbravecounseling.org, or you can go to www.walkingbravebook.com, and you can connect with Lauren there for speaking, presenting on different mental health topics, or sharing her own story. And you can look there for telehealth counseling anywhere in Colorado, or in-person counseling as well. So Lauren, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your story, and modeling that vulnerability to others.
Yeah, thank you. I am Lauren Pryor, and I need a counselor.
Awesome. Us too.
And I'm Chrissa Hunt.
I'm Julie Johnson, and we need a counselor.
So do you.
Thank you for listening to the You Need a Counselor podcast. We are so grateful that you're here. Now, we want to hear from you. Text us or give us a call at 515-650-3231. You can also find and connect with You Need a Counselor on Facebook and Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's show, please take a moment to like, review, or leave a comment, as all of these things help others to find and benefit from the podcast as well. If you're in the state of Iowa and interested in mental health counseling or behavioral health intervention services, give us a call at 800-531-4236.